Is it so then that the Earth system is starting to send invoices? Because the Earth system has never done so. In fact, the Earth system has been our best friend. It's been buffering essentially all our environmental pressures up until very recently. But now I would argue we're starting to see the first signals of something potentially happening. This is very, very complex. It is always going to be associated with a lot of uncertainty. But when Hurricane Sandy, 2 years back, suddenly surprisingly veers right into Manhattan and puts even Wall Street 3 meters underwater, and a cynical reminder that the financial system is connected to the biosphere. Science after that showed that it's very difficult to explain the sudden veering of hurricanes year after year veer right out into the Atlantic without considering the fact that we know that the Arctic vortex collapsed 2 years before. And the Arctic vortex is the system that holds cold air up in the Arctic. When this collapsed, you get high pressure cold air pushing down lower altitudes under certain climatic conditions, which could explain how this hurricane was suddenly veered right into land, totally unexpectedly. We also saw freak winter events in the part of the world where I come from, in Sweden. Now, we also have more and more evidence that methane release under the seabed in Siberia is starting to occur in a way which way exceeds what was expected. We also have more and more science indicating something very dramatic, that the Arab Spring, which of course was triggered by tremendous social momentum of a young, connected, intellectual generation rising against 30 years of dictatorial rule, would be difficult to come to scale if we don't also factor in the food riots that we had 2 years before due to 350% rise in phosphorus prices, the most important fertilizer, 120% rise in oil prices, and the fact that President Putin and Prime Minister Rudd in Australia, Putin in Russia, shut their export borders of cereals because of unprecedented forest fires in Russia and 12 years of drought in Australia. Now, if you mesh that all together in a social ecological analysis, you can no longer exclude that this is the first example in human history on Earth where social ecological interactions abruptly collide and destabilize societies at a regional scale. Now, of course, again, uncertainties are large, but you cannot exclude it. And just a few months back, Peter Glick published this paper, which showed that 4 years before the civil war in Syria, we have the worst consecutive drought years ever measured. Probably the worst drought years since agriculture was invented 8,000 years back in Mesopotamia, in this region. And we know as a fact that 2 million rural inhabitants had to leave rural areas and move into cities like Aleppo right before the civil war broke out. Again, the causality is extremely complicated. Nobody can claim that this is a driver of what's happening in Syria, but clearly this is something that is occurring simultaneously with these kind of social disruptions. This is the world of the Anthropocene. This is the world where we can no longer exclude the Earth system sending invoices. We know that the frequency of extreme events is increasing. We know that heat waves are at an unprecedented level. We know that the 2003 heat wave in Europe, which killed 40,000 people, the worst environmental disaster in Europe ever, in fact, has and cannot be excluded or disentangled from anthropogenic climate change. We know that the number of reported disasters, so-called natural disasters, are on the increase. And look at where the rise comes from. It's the green category here, which is floods. The number of floods are increasing exponentially, and this is something that can no longer be, again, disentangled from human-induced climate change. So we're in this turbulent era that Thomas Friedman of New York Times has, I think, very eloquently put to say, we all recognize we live in a hyper-connected world, socially, financially, trade-wise. Now we need to recognize we live in an interdependent world where we actually start seeing links between the biophysical changes we're occurring at the global scale and the social changes. And therefore we need to understand that the capacity of the system to stay stable is something we need to recognize.